The Bahamas. Crystal blue water. Powder white sand. Warm trade winds rolling across a sea so clear you can watch the light bend through it all the way to the bottom. For most people, the Bahamas is the destination at the end of a long year of hard work. A place you fly into, spend a week, and carry home in photographs. But for Brian and Lynette Hooker, it was simply Tuesday. It was simply life. Because Brian and Lynette Hooker did not vacation on the water. They lived on it. They were from Michigan, a landlocked state of cold winters and flat horizons. But somewhere along the way, they made a decision that most people only ever imagine making. They left the house, left the routine, left the ordinary gravity of life on land, and moved aboard a sailboat they named Soulmate. And for a while, at least from the outside, the life they built together on that vessel looked like a dream that had actually come true. Then came the night of April 4th, 2025, and after that night, only one of them was ever seen again. Before we go any further, if you are watching this and you want to follow every development in this case as it unfolds, now is the moment to subscribe to Case Hunt TV. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Cases like this one move fast, and you do not want to be the last one to know. Lynette Hooker disappeared in the waters of the Bahamas. Her husband, Brian Hooker, told authorities that she fell from their small dinghy into the sea. He said the weather was rough. He said he tried to find her. He said she was simply gone. Bahamian authorities searched. American investigators paid attention. Lynette's family waited. And as the days turned to weeks, the story Brian Hooker was telling began to develop cracks that no amount of rough weather or ocean current could explain away. Because the ocean may be vast, and the sea may be indifferent, but the digital systems aboard a modern sailboat remember everything. GPS coordinates do not drift with the tide. An automatic tracking system does not forget where a vessel was parked in the dark. And when investigators began comparing what Brian Hooker said happened with what the data showed actually happened, the discrepancy was not small. It was not a rounding error. It was not a misremembered detail from a traumatic night. It was the kind of gap that sends federal dive teams into foreign waters with a very specific set of coordinates. That is exactly where this case now stands. To understand how it got here, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the night Lynette disappeared, but to the life she and Brian were living before that night. Because context matters in a case like this. The setting matters. The relationship matters. The choices made long before April 4th matter enormously. Brian and Lynette Hooker were a married couple who had made the full transition to what the sailing community calls the live-aboard lifestyle. They did not keep a home in Michigan and sail on weekends. Soulmate was their address. It was their kitchen, their bedroom, their living room, their world. They were part of a broader community of people who have chosen the ocean over the mortgage, who measure distance in nautical miles rather than highway exits, who wake up in a different anchorage than the one where they fell asleep. It is a life that demands a certain kind of commitment, a certain kind of partnership, and a certain kind of trust. Because when you are living on a boat far from land, you are dependent on the person beside you in ways that most couples on land never experience. Brian Hooker was described by those who knew him as experienced on the water. He knew boats. He knew the sea. He had been living this life long enough to understand the rhythms of it, the dangers of it, the demands of it. Lynette, by accounts that would later surface publicly, was no stranger to the water either. She was described as a strong swimmer, someone capable and physically able to handle herself in the kinds of conditions that the Bahamas can present. Even when the weather turns, that matters. It matters a great deal, because Brian Hooker's account of the night Lynette disappeared rests heavily on the idea that she fell into the water and could not be found. And when the person who allegedly fell is described by those who knew her as a capable, experienced swimmer, the question of how she simply vanished becomes considerably more difficult to answer with the word accident. There was something else beneath the surface of this sailing life, something that Lynette's own daughter would later speak about publicly. The relationship between Brian and Lynette was not always smooth water. According to the daughter, the relationship could be volatile. There were problems. Those problems were sometimes connected to alcohol. Whether both of them drank or whether one of them drank is a detail that has been characterized slightly differently in different accounts, but the through line is consistent. The relationship had turbulence, and the daughter was not the only one to say so. Even people who knew Brian Hooker, people who might reasonably be expected to defend him or at minimum give him the benefit of the doubt, expressed skepticism when his version of the night Lynette disappeared became public. These were not strangers looking for a villain in a news story. These were people who knew him, and they said his account did not make sense. That skepticism, coming from his own circle, is the kind of detail that investigators do not overlook. April 4th, 2025. The Bahamas. Brian Hooker later told authorities that he and Lynette had been on land and were returning to Soulmate by dinghy. The dinghy in question was 8 feet long. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the size of a very large dining room table. Two adults sitting in an 8-foot inflatable dinghy are not separated by any meaningful distance. They are close. They are within arm's reach of each other. There is no significant space between them. Brian said the weather was rough. He said Lynette fell overboard from the dinghy. He said he was unable to locate her in the dark water. He said she was gone. He reported her missing to Bahamian authorities. A search was launched. Rescue crews went out into the water in the area Brian described. They found no sign of Lynette Hooker. Not her body, not her clothing, not a single piece of physical evidence that she had ever been in that water. Bahamian law enforcement took Brian Hooker into custody for questioning. Under Bahamian law, they were permitted to hold him without charging him for a defined period. They held him for the maximum they could, 5 full days. During those 5 days, Brian was questioned. He cooperated, at least to a degree. He told them his story. The weather was rough. She fell. He could not find her. He answered their questions. After 5 days, they had to release him. Bahamian law required it. They did not have, at that point, sufficient evidence to formally charge him. But when they let him go, the investigators were not quiet about what they believed. They made it clear this was not over. They had to release him. That did not mean they believed him. While he was still in the Bahamas, before his release, Brian Hooker gave media interviews. He made public statements. He told reporters and cameras that he was devastated, that he wanted to find his wife, that he was not leaving the Bahamas, that he would stay until she was found. These were not private words whispered in a phone call to a family member. These were public declarations, on camera for the record. Then, he was released from custody. And almost immediately, Brian Hooker left the Bahamas. He did not organize a search. He did not coordinate with rescue teams. He did not return to the waters where he said his wife had gone under. He came back to the United States, and then he went quiet. No more interviews. No public appeals to keep the search alive. No statements asking people to keep looking. His attorneys released occasional comments on his behalf, statements maintaining his innocence and saying he had nothing to do with Lynette's disappearance, that he missed her, that he wanted her found. But Brian himself was not heard from. The contrast between the man who stood in front of cameras in the Bahamas saying he would never leave without finding his wife, and the man who departed quietly for the United States and then fell silent, was not lost on investigators. It was not lost on Lynette's daughter, and it was not lost on anyone paying careful attention to how people behave when they have something to hide. There is a documented behavioral pattern in cases involving what prosecutors call nobody homicides. Cases where someone is killed, but the body is never found, and the investigation and potential prosecution must proceed without that foundational piece of evidence. Researchers and prosecutors who have studied these cases extensively have observed something that may seem counterintuitive, but that holds remarkably consistent across dozens of cases. The person responsible for the death almost never participates meaningfully in the search for the missing person. They know the search will find nothing because they know what happened. And so even when logic and optics would seem to demand that they appear visibly, publicly, desperately engaged in finding their loved one, they do not. The futility of the exercise, when you know there is nothing to find, appears to override even basic self-preservation instinct. Brian Hooker promised to stay and search. He left. He went silent. Every day, he did not ask the public for help. Finding Lynette was another data point in a pattern investigators recognized immediately. Meanwhile, the investigation was developing on a different front entirely, one that Brian Hooker could not have anticipated controlling as completely as he may have controlled his own words and his own actions. Because modern boats are full of systems that observe and record whether their owners want them to or not, Soulmate was equipped with GPS tracking. This is standard on any vessel of its size. GPS data records where the boat is at any given time with significant precision. When investigators obtained the GPS data from Soulmate, they compared those coordinates to the account Brian Hooker had given about where he and Lynette were on the night of April 4th, when he said she fell overboard. The locations did not match. This was not a minor discrepancy that could be attributed to the fog of a traumatic night, to confusion while searching, to the disorientation of someone in grief. The difference between where Brian said the boat was and where the GPS data showed actually was raised serious alarm among investigators. Serious enough that the determination was made to send a search team, not to the area Brian described, but to the area the GPS data indicated. That is a crucial detail to sit with for a moment. If Brian's account of where Lynette went into the water had been accurate, searchers would have been looking in the wrong location from the very beginning, which means that if Lynette's remains are anywhere to be found, they may be in a place that no one was looking during the initial search, because the initial search was guided by information that investigators now believe was false. The GPS discrepancy was damning on its own. But it was not the only piece of digital evidence that complicated Brian Hooker's story. Soulmate was also equipped with an automatic identification system, known in maritime circles as AIs. CGIS is a tracking technology used by vessels to broadcast their position, speed, and heading to other ships and to maritime authorities. It is a safety system as much as anything. It helps other boats know where you are. It helps search and rescue know where to find you if something goes wrong. It is, in a sense, the maritime equivalent of a phone constantly pinging a cell tower. The AIS system aboard Soulmate was turned off on the evening of April 4th, 2025. It did not come back on until the morning of April 5th. That window, the dark window when Soulmate was effectively invisible to any external tracking system, corresponds precisely to the period during which Lynette Hooker allegedly fell from the dinghy and disappeared. AIS systems do not turn themselves off. They do not malfunction in ways that conveniently align with the hours during which a woman goes missing. They are deactivated deliberately by a person with knowledge of the system, who understands that turning it off makes the vessel undetectable. Why would someone turn off an AIS system at the exact moment his wife was allegedly falling into the ocean? If you have no reason to hide where your boat is, you have no reason to turn it off. If you are searching desperately for your missing wife, you would want maritime authorities to know exactly where you are at all times so they can coordinate rescue efforts. Turning off AIs during an active emergency is not the behavior of someone trying to be found. It is the behavior of someone trying not to be. Taken together, the GPS discrepancy and the AI's shutdown represented something that legal experts described plainly: a lie about location and a deliberate effort to conceal that location in real time. These were not the mistakes of a grieving man. They were, investigators believed, the choices of someone who knew exactly what had happened and was trying to ensure that no one else would be able to prove it. Based on this evidence, the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service, CGIS, moved to secure Soulmate. The vessel was taken into federal custody. It was initially brought to the Coast Guard station in Fort Pierce, Florida. Crime scene tape was placed around it. Investigators who appeared to be forensic specialists were observed moving on and off the boat, conducting what looked to anyone watching like a thorough and systematic evidence collection process. Later, the boat was moved again, from Fort Pierce to the Coast Guard station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where it remained in federal custody. The reasons for the transfer were not publicly explained, but the significance of the move was clear. Federal investigators were not done with Soulmate. Whatever they were looking for, they had not yet finished looking. The boat became, in effect, the most important crime scene available to investigators. Because in a case like this, where the alleged crime happened in the open ocean, where the ocean itself is not a crime scene that can be processed or preserved, the vessel is the best available substitute. If violence occurred before Lynette went into the water, evidence of that violence would be aboard Soulmate. DNA, blood, hair, fiber, any physical trace of a struggle, any indication that something happened on the boat itself and not on the small dinghy, as Brian claimed. This matters because of what Brian said versus what Brian said. Follow that logic carefully. Brian told investigators that Lynette fell from the dinghy, not from the boat, not from the deck of Soulmate, from the small dinghy they were using to travel from shore back to their anchored vessel. If that is true, if the incident happened entirely in the dinghy and in the water, then the large sailboat should be pristine. There should be nothing aboard Soulmate that is inconsistent with a normal evening at sea. No signs of struggle, no unexplained biological material, no damage that could not be easily explained. But if something happened aboard Soulmate before Lynette ever got near the dinghy, then the boat becomes the location of the crime, and the story about the dinghy becomes the cover. Investigators were looking for the answer to exactly that question. And the fact that a month passed between the incident and the U.S. seizure of the vessel created complications. Whoever had control of the boat during that intervening period, whether Bahamian authorities or Brian Hooker himself, the chain of custody over potential evidence was not clean. Defense attorneys would eventually have something to work with there, but investigators believed the evidence worth finding was still aboard, and they went looking for it. As the forensic examination of the boat proceeded, the official designation of the investigation changed. CGIS had initially described the case as a criminal investigation, a designation that already represented a significant step beyond a missing persons case. Then federal sources indicated the designation had been elevated again. The case was now being treated as a murder investigation. That is a word that carries weight. Murder, not accident, not misadventure, not unexplained disappearance. Murder. The federal authorities investigating the case had moved to a point where they believed a crime had been committed, that Lynette Hooker had not fallen accidentally from a dinghy in rough weather, and that the investigation should be conducted with the full force and resources appropriate to a homicide case. Legal experts who analyzed the case publicly noted the distinction mattered practically, not just semantically. A missing persons investigation and a murder investigation deploy different resources, follow different protocols, and carry different investigative intensity. Treating the disappearance of Lynette Hooker as a murder meant that every piece of evidence, every statement, every behavioral data point would be examined through the lens of building a homicide case. It meant the standard was higher, the scrutiny was greater, and the resources committed to the investigation reflected an institutional belief that a woman had been killed. With the GPS data in hand and a murder investigation underway, CGI sought and received permission from Bahamian authorities to conduct an underwater search in the specific area identified by the GPS coordinates. A Coast Guard dive team was deployed to the Bahamas. They were searching for Lynette Hooker, in the place the data suggested she was most likely to be found, not the place Brian Hooker said she fell. The search faced formidable challenges from the start. Significant time had passed since April 4th. Ocean currents move in patterns that are often predictable but not always precise. Marine life is not neutral in what happens to remains in open water, and the statistics on recovering bodies that have been in open ocean for weeks are not encouraging. Water disposal is, according to documented research on no-body homicide cases, the single most common method of body disposal in cases where the disposal location is eventually identified. It is the most common precisely because it is the most effective. Recovering remains from open water is extraordinarily difficult. There are no tracks to follow, no scent trails for trained dogs, no ground to dig up. There is only water, depth, current, and time. There are notable historical cases that illustrate just how permanent water disposal can be. In the state of Delaware, a man named Thomas Capano was convicted of murdering Anne-Marie Fahey, a woman he had been involved with romantically. He disposed of her body in a cooler that was weighted and sunk in the ocean off the coast. Despite investigators knowing what had happened, despite a conviction being secured, Anne-Marie Fahey's body was never recovered. The ocean kept her. A cooler provides some protection from the elements, and still she was never found. The ocean is patient in ways that human investigations cannot always afford to be. Investigators knew this. They deployed the dive team anyway, because even a search that finds nothing is information. And because the GPS data gave them a specific target, this was not a general search of open water. This was a directed search based on digital evidence. Whether that search would yield results remained to be seen. Throughout all of this, Lynette's daughter continued to speak publicly. She had given interviews from early in the case. She had made clear from the beginning that she did not believe Brian Hooker's account. She had spoken about the volatility of the relationship, about the role alcohol played in the tensions between Brian and her mother, about her own instincts and her own grief and her own determination that her mother's disappearance not be quietly filed away as a maritime accident. Her voice in this case is not simply the voice of a grieving family member. It is the voice of someone with direct knowledge of the relationship dynamics that investigators view as critical context. In no-body homicide cases, the nature of the relationship between the victim and the primary suspect is one of the most important pillars of any eventual prosecution. Documented evidence of a volatile relationship, of recurring conflicts, of patterns of behavior that suggest escalating danger, all of that becomes part of the architecture of a case that will ultimately need to stand before a jury without a body. Researchers who have studied no-body homicide prosecutions extensively have documented that approximately 54% of all such cases that have gone to trial involved a domestic relationship between the victim and the defendant, a spouse, a partner, an ex-partner. The reason is straightforward and grim. When someone kills a person they are in a relationship with, they face an immediate and overwhelming problem. They are the obvious suspect. Everyone knows they were together. Everyone knows there is a history. The body, if it can be made to disappear, is the one piece of evidence that most directly ties the crime to the killer. Without it, you have a missing person instead of a murder victim. You have a tragedy instead of a crime. And the person with the most to gain from that reclassification is the person standing beside the missing woman on the night she vanished. Legal analysts examining the case noted several important considerations about the path to prosecution. First, the question of probable cause, the GPS discrepancy, the AI shutdown, the behavioral patterns, and the volatile relationship together represent a significant body of circumstantial evidence. Legal experts who assessed the publicly available information suggested that investigators likely had sufficient probable cause to support an arrest. But probable cause is a threshold, not a destination. The standard that matters at trial is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and that standard in a no-body case is a considerably higher mountain to climb. Second, the question of what Brian said during his 5 days of interrogation in the Bahamas. He provided a statement. He gave investigators a version of events. That version of events is now contradicted in key respects by the digital evidence from his own boat. Statements that are later demonstrated to be false can be extraordinarily powerful in a criminal case. The question of whether those statements, made to Bahamian authorities under Bahamian law, would be admissible in an American federal court was a legal complexity that prosecutors would need to navigate carefully. American courts apply American rules of evidence. Whether Brian was cautioned in a manner sufficient to satisfy the standards that apply in U.S. proceedings was a question with significant implications. Third, the question of flight risk. Brian Hooker had no fixed address on land. His home was a boat. He had already demonstrated a willingness to leave a jurisdiction quickly once the pressure was off. He had the means and the experience to travel in ways that are considerably harder to track than a plane ticket. Legal observers suggested that regardless of whether an arrest was imminent, investigators had good reason to pursue limitations on his travel, including seeking his passport, before he could place himself beyond the reach of American law enforcement. This case sits in an interesting and important position within the category of no-body homicides. Prosecutors who specialize in this area of law routinely describe these cases as among the most challenging to bring to trial. The absence of a body removes the most fundamental piece of evidence in any homicide case. It removes confirmation that a crime occurred at all. It removes cause of death. It removes physical evidence that ties the crime to a specific location and a specific method. It requires prosecutors to build their entire case out of circumstantial evidence, behavioral analysis, and the documented contradictions between what a suspect said and what the evidence shows. But within the universe of no-body cases, this one has features that are relatively unusual. In many no-body cases, investigators do not know when the victim disappeared, where they disappeared, or who was with them at the time. In this case, by Brian Hooker's own admission, all three of those things are known. He was the last person with Lynette. She disappeared on the night of April 4th. It happened in Bahamian waters. The when, the where, and the who are not in dispute. What is in dispute is the how, and the evidence accumulating around the how is pointing in one direction. Prosecutors building a no-body case look for several specific things. They look for lies that can be proven to be lies. They have that here, in the form of GPS data that contradicts Brian's stated location. They look for consciousness of guilt, actions taken that only make sense if the person knows a crime occurred. They have that here, in the form of an AIS system turned off during the critical window. They look for behavioral evidence, the gap between what an innocent grieving person would do and what the suspect actually did. They have that here, in the departure from the Bahamas, the silence, the absence of any meaningful search effort. They look for relationship evidence, documented patterns of volatility that provide a foundation for understanding why the crime might have occurred. They have that here from Lynette's own daughter. None of these elements is sufficient on its own, but together, they form the kind of cumulative circumstantial case that no-body prosecutions are built on, and juries, contrary to what defense attorneys might hope, are capable of following circumstantial evidence to logical conclusions. They do it in no-body cases with regularity. The absence of a body is not the absence of a case. It is a challenge, and it is a challenge that experienced federal prosecutors have met before and continue to meet. There is one final element of this case that deserves careful attention, because it is the kind of detail that resonates with anyone who has ever watched someone grieve and felt something was slightly wrong with what they were seeing. Brian Hooker was a man whose wife had allegedly just died in a terrible accident. She had fallen into the sea at night, in rough weather, and he had been unable to save her. If that is true, if that is even partially true, then what you would expect from Brian Hooker in the days and weeks following that night is inconsolable grief. You would expect the frantic energy of someone who cannot accept what has happened. You would expect a man who could not stop looking, could not stop asking for help, could not stop appealing to anyone and everyone who might help bring his wife home, or at minimum, bring her body home, so she could be laid to rest with some dignity. What you would not expect is for a man in that position to give a few media interviews, make some public declarations about staying to search, then quietly leave the country when released from custody, and go entirely silent. You would not expect a man who loved his wife, who lost her in front of him, who was there and could not grab her and pull her back into that tiny boat, to then simply stop talking about her, to stop asking, to stop appealing, to go quiet in a way that serves no one except possibly himself. This behavioral absence, the failure to do what an innocent, grieving person would naturally do, is documented in case after case in the no-body homicide literature as one of the most consistent indicators of guilt. Not the only indicator, not proof in itself, but a pattern that experienced investigators and prosecutors recognize immediately because they have seen it before, in case after case, where a person who knew exactly what happened to the missing person had absolutely no interest in helping anyone else find out. As of the latest developments in this case, Soulmate remains impounded by federal authorities in Fort Lauderdale. The dive team deployed to the Bahamas based on GPS coordinates was actively searching the area investigators identified. The investigation has been officially designated as a murder investigation by federal sources. Brian Hooker has not been charged. His attorneys maintain his complete innocence. And Lynette Hooker has not been found. Somewhere in the clear blue water of the Bahamas, or possibly in the quiet of a federal evidence facility in Florida, the answer to what happened on the night of April 4th, 2025, is waiting. The GPS data is not waiting. The AIS logs are not waiting. The forensic evidence from the boat is not waiting. These are fixed points. They exist. They will not change. and the investigation built around them is not slowing down. The water does not keep secrets forever. And the digital record of where a boat was on a dark April night in the Bahamas does not care about the story a man tells to save himself. Lynette Hooker was someone's wife. She was someone's mother. She was a woman who made a life on the open sea and trusted the person beside her in that life. She deserves answers. Her family deserves answers. And the investigation now underway, with federal dive teams in the water and a seized boat under forensic examination and a GPS record that does not match the story, suggests that those answers may be closer than Brian Hooker intended. That is where this case stands right now, and it is moving fast. If you want to stay with this story, if you want every update as this investigation develops, then make sure you're subscribed to Case Hunt TV. Hit the like button on this video so that more people can find this case and follow it alongside you. Every like, every subscription, every share tells the platform that this story matters and keeps it in front of people who need to see it. Subscribe to Case Hunt TV right now, turn on your notifications, and do not let this story disappear the way someone may have hoped Lynette Hooker would. The search is ongoing. This case is not closed, and we will be here every step of the way.